He doesn't belong here. That was all it took. Just 5 words, barely whispered over the bank manager's shoulder to the security guard, and a silent chain reaction began. A chain reaction born not of facts, but of fear and assumptions. The tall black man in the tailored navy blue suit hadn't even reached the front of the line yet. He hadn't raised his voice, caused a disturbance, or made anyone uncomfortable. He had simply stepped through the glass doors of the downtown financial branch and made his way to the reception desk like any other client. But he stood out, not because he was loud, not because he was dressed inappropriately or looked unwell. No, he stood out because of how calm he was, how purposeful, how ... confident. The manager, a man named Greg Whitmore, watched him with narrowed eyes. Something about the man didn't sit right with him. He looked wealthy, important, even. But in Greg's mind, that only made him more suspicious. The man didn't flinch when asked to wait. He didn't look around nervously or fumble through his wallet like someone unsure of what they were doing. He simply stood by the corner of the reception desk, briefcase in one hand, phone in the other, scrolling through messages with an almost military stillness. Greg had worked at the bank for 12 years. He'd been taught to trust your gut, and right now his gut told him something was off. The man mid to late 50s maybe was too composed. That suit, custom tailored, that watch, limited edition, Omega, those shoes, polished black leather that hadn't seen a scuff in years. And then there was the amount he had written down on the note handed to the receptionist. Withdraw. $150,000.00 in cash. Greg's stomach clenched. To Greg it was a red flag. Who walks into a bank in broad daylight and asks for that kind of money in cash? Criminals, scammers, maybe someone using a fake identity? He felt his heartbeat quicken. The man's ID had been handed over for verification, and as far as the receptionist could tell, everything was legitimate. But Greg wasn't convinced. Something about the whole situation felt ... wrong. He leaned toward the security guard, pretending to check a form. Just keep an eye on him, he muttered. If anything feels off, nod, and I'll hit the silent. But the more he watched the man, the more uneasy he became. He didn't like how calm he looked, how sure of himself he seemed, like he owned the place, like he didn't need permission to be there. It was then with a flick of his wrist that Greg reached below the desk and pressed the silent alarm. A small red dot lit up beneath the counter and seen by customers, but bright enough for trained eyes. In less than 60 seconds, the FBI would receive an alert. Greg had set the alarm not for a robbery, for a level 2 suspicious activity protocols. Something flagged when there was a potential financial crime, involving high-dollar transactions and possible ID fraud. He leaned back in his chair, glancing around the bank as if everything were normal. Customers were chatting in line. The hum of small talk and ringing phones filled the air. The receptionist smiled at the man again, assuring him that someone would be right with him. She didn't suspect a thing, but Greg was ready. He watched the front doors like a hawk. Then, less than 90 seconds later, the mood in the lobby shifted. Fast, too. Men in suits stormed through the double glass doors with quiet, surgical intensity. No loud voices, no drawn guns. Just an unmistakable sense of authority. Their jackets flared open slightly, revealing the unmistakable glint of a badge clipped to a belt and a firearm secured just under the ribs. They weren't police. They were federal. One of them, lean man with sharp eyes and salt and pepper hair, scanned the room like a hawk. The other, broader, younger, and wearing mirrored sunglasses despite being indoors, locked immediately on the man standing at the reception desk. It was subtle, but customers around them shifted uncomfortably. The receptionist's smile faltered. The suited man looked up from his phone slowly, eyes calm, almost unreadable. Salt and Pepper made a gesture, slight tilt of the head. Mirrored sunglasses stepped forward, hand hovering near his holster. Greg felt a strange surge of excitement in his chest, like something important was about to happen, like he'd just stopped a major crime from unfolding right in front of him. All eyes were on the man now. He hadn't said a word, hadn't moved, but somehow the whole room seemed to orbit around him. Even now, he didn't look worried. Just ... aware, and then He did something unexpected. He turned around slowly, deliberately, and raised both hands, not in fear, not like someone surrendering, but in a gesture that was oddly composed. "I expected better," the man said, voice steady and deep. Greg blinked. "Wait. Dot. What?" Sultan Pepper's eyes widened slightly. His jaw moved, but no sound came out. Then he seemed to snap out of whatever trance had overtaken him. He stepped forward quickly, pushing the sunglasses agent aside. Then, to Greg's astonishment, he stood at attention and raised his hand in a sharp salute. A salute in the middle of the bank. To the man Greg had just called the FBI on. The second agent followed suit. Lowering his sunglasses slightly and saluting as well, gasps rippled through the room. Greg stood up suddenly, confusion gripping him like a fist. What was happening? The man slowly lowered his hands, nodded slightly in acknowledgement, and said with unnerving calm, "Colonel David Langston, U.S. Air Force, retired. Medal of Honor." It was like someone had turned down the volume on the world. For a moment, the entire bank was frozen in stunned silence. Greg's mouth opened, but no words came out. He felt cold sweat running down the back of his neck. The colonel turned his gaze toward him, sharp, piercing, not angry, but profoundly disappointed. Greg suddenly remembered the name. Colonel David Langston. There had been something in the news a few years ago, a ceremony at the Pentagon. A story about valor, sacrifice, and a rescue mission that saved 22 soldiers from behind enemy lines. A living legend, and Greg had just called the FBI on him. He looked down at the silent alarm indicator, still glowing red. The weight of what he'd done settled in. Not just the mistake, but the reason behind it. He hadn't asked for further ID. He hadn't looked deeper. He'd made a snap judgment based on appearance, on race, on confidence. The man hadn't been suspicious. He had been exceptional, and Greg had chosen to see a threat where there was only honor. Colonel Langston said nothing more as the agents flanked him respectfully outside. Flashing lights began to reflect off the glass news vans. Word had spread fast. One of the tellers must have tweeted about the scene unfolding. Cell phones were already up, filming the moment, but the colonel didn't care. He adjusted his suit jacket with dignity, picked up his briefcase, and prepared to leave. Greg couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He had pressed a button to bring the FBI to his bank. And instead of arresting a criminal, they had saluted a hero. And Colonel Langston? He hadn't even needed to raise his voice. He had let the truth speak for itself. And in that moment, Greg realized, what you see when someone walks through your door says more about you than it ever says about them. He watched in silence as the doors opened, and the colonel stepped out, leaving behind a room full of wide eyes. Racing thoughts and a shame that hung heavier than any silence could ever describe, the man didn't flinch. Not when the agent stepped forward, not when the weight of the room shifted entirely onto his shoulders, not even when the younger agent's hand hovered just inches from the butt of his firearm. His hands were raised, yes, but there was no panic in his posture, no desperation. The kind of calm that came from experience. From having stood in rooms more dangerous than this one? From having stared death in the face and watched it blink first. The tall man's voice broke the silence, like a knife slicing through velvet. Expected better. 3 words. Quiet, measured, delivered not like an accusation, but a disappointment. Agent Ramirez, the older man with the salt and pepper hair, stared at him, blinking hard like his brain was racing to catch up to his eyes. The name the man had given? It echoed in Ramirez's mind like a distant alarm finally reaching his consciousness. Colonel David Langston. The realization hit him all at once, like a file unlocking in his head, like 1,000 photographs in a government archive suddenly. Clicking into place, he took a step forward, the weight of his badge suddenly feeling a lot heavier. Ramirez's jaw set. He stopped a few feet from the man. Then slowly, without asking for orders, without waiting for permission, he raised his right hand to his brow and gave a crisp, clean salute. It was sharp, military sharp, respect sharp. It wasn't for show. It was instinct. Agent Marks the younger. One hesitated. He glanced at Ramirez, then at the man standing between them. "What's going on?" muttered under his breath, uncertain. Ramirez didn't look at him. He just held the salute a moment longer, then finally said, loud enough for the entire bank to hear, "You're Colonel Langston?" The man nodded once, the barest movement of his chin. "I didn't recognize you at first," Ramirez added, and... Now there was an edge of regret in his voice. Langston didn't respond immediately. He simply lowered his hands and adjusted his sleeve. As if this situation, this chaos, this absurd misunderstanding was just another Monday in a life full of complications. Then he said, "You're not the first. But I thought maybe. Wouldn't be like the rest." The air in the room thickened, not with violence, but with realization. With the slow dawning awareness that something deeply wrong had just unfolded in front of everyone's eyes. A customer at the back of the line, an older woman holding a checkbook, whispered to her husband, "Did he say Colonel?" Another Manurley, 20's earbuds in, had already stopped pretending to scroll on his phone and started recording. The words Medal of Honor hadn't even been spoken yet. The vibe had shifted entirely. Then Langston finally said it. "Colonel David. Langston, U.S. Air Force. Retired. Medal of Honor." The words landed like a bomb in the center of the room. The woman at the checkbook gasped. A young mother holding her toddler turned toward the man in awe. The receptionist's mouth fell open slightly. Even Agent Mark straightened, his previous skepticism dissolving into a kind of stunned silence. The weight of those words wasn't in their syllables. It was in what they represented. Years of service, blood spilled, lives saved, a citation so rare that only a few living Americans could claim it. And yet here he stood, profiled, doubted, nearly detained. Ramirez lowered his salute with reverence. "Sir," he said quietly, "I am truly sorry." Langston's eyes deep, steel-grayed, rested on Ramirez for a long moment. "Don't apologize for yourself," he said, calm and cool. "You didn't press the alarm." The manager's desk, Greg Whitmore, who only moments earlier had been flushed with self-importance, now looked like a man who had wandered onto the wrong stage during a play he didn't understand. His eyes darted between the colonel and the agents. His hands gripped the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Langston didn't move toward him, didn't need to. He simply said, loud enough for the entire bank to hear, "You assumed I was a threat, not because of what I did, but because of how I looked." Greg swallowed hard. "I walked in with a briefcase," Langston continued, voice low and steady. "Asked for a large withdrawal from my own account. My ID was valid, my record's clean. My suit cost more than your car. You decided I didn't belong here." Greg started, voice cracking, but Langston raised a hand. "I don't want excuses. I want accountability. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a tantrum. It was a line in the sand." By now the rest of the bank was completely silent. Phones had stopped ringing. Conversations were dead. Every customer and teller had stopped moving. They were watching history unfold, and no one dared to interrupt it. Ramirez stepped back slightly, giving Langston the space he clearly owned. He recognized the authority, the gravity. He knew when to speak and when to stay the hell out of the way. Then something remarkable happened. A woman stepped forward. She was young, maybe early 30s, business casual, and clearly shaken. "Sir," she said, addressing Langston directly, "I just want to say thank you for your service." Langston turned slightly, nodded to her. Then another voice, this one male. "Same here." "Thank you, Colonel." One by one, people began to murmur their gratitude. And then someone no one ever remembered exactly who started clapping, just one person at first. Then another. Then the sound grew, not loud and raucous, but measured, respectful, rising like a tide that had been waiting too long to crash. The entire lobby filled with the sound of applause. Customers, tellers, even the security guard near the exit, all of them joined in. Greg remained standing at his desk, frozen in place, watching as his mistake played out in real time before an unwilling audience. His shame was not private, it was communal. Everyone could see it. Langston didn't smile. He didn't revel in it. Instead, he let the moment speak for itself. Then he looked directly at Greg and said the final words he would speak in that building. Next time, treat people like they belong before you assume they don't. With that, he turned, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward the doors. Agent Ramirez and Agent Marks fell in behind him, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because this man had earned more than an escort. He had earned reverence. As the glass doors parted and sunlight spilled into the bank, flashes from smartphones lit up like paparazzi. Someone outside had recognized him. Maybe the video from inside had already gone viral. It didn't matter. Colonel David Langston walked out of that bank without his handcuffs, without confrontation, without raising his voice, because he didn't need to fight for dignity. He had lived it, fought for it, earned it. And in that quiet room filled with clicking keyboards, pounding hearts, and now a silence heavier than thunder, he had taught every single person watching a lesson they would never forget. He came in for his money, but what he withdrew that day was far more valuable. Every ounce of doubt, every shadow of ignorance, every unspoken bias exposed and laid bare in the midday light. And with every step he took away from that place, he didn't just leave behind the echo of a moment, he left behind a mirror. A mirror for them to look into and decide who they really were. The first sound to break the silence after the colonel exited the building was a single, chic exhale from the bank manager. Greg Whitmore stood motionless at his desk, staring at the now-closed glass doors as if he could somehow reverse time by will alone. The buzz of fluorescent lights overhead returned. The rhythm of computers worried back to life. But everything else felt off. The applause had faded, but its weight still lingered in the air like smoke. Not celebratory, more like a reckoning. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had felt it. The humiliation. The honor. The truth. Greg reached for his water bottle with trembling fingers. It was suddenly hard to breathe, even harder to think. He had thought this was going to be another Tuesday, another day of managing accounts, rejecting questionable checks, and pretending to listen during conference calls. But now, all of that seemed impossibly small. A teller approached his desk carefully, like someone approaching a wild animal. "Yes, sir. There are reporters outside," she said softly. "They're asking for a statement." Greg didn't respond. He couldn't. How do you explain a mistake like that in a press quote? How do you condense racial profiling, unconscious bias, and a nationwide viral moment into something PR safe? Outside, Colonel Langston walked past the flashing camera lights as if they weren't even there. A few reporters shouted questions. "Colonel, care to comment on what just happened inside? Were you threatened? Are you pressing charges? Did they know who you were when they called the FBI?" Langston paused for just a moment. He turned his head slightly toward the sea of microphones, but said nothing. Instead, he offered a tight nod, brief but firm, then continued walking down the sidewalk as if he had somewhere more important to be, because he did, because he always had. The agents followed close behind, not to protect him, but because their presence felt appropriate, like an honor guard. One of them, Agent Marks, looked visibly uncomfortable, the weight of the misunderstanding pressing down on him. He hadn't recognized the colonel. He hadn't connected the dots. But now that he had, something inside him had shifted. Marks finally said, catching up to him, "I want to apologize. We didn't know. If we had, you would have acted differently." Langston interrupted, still walking, not unkindly, but with intention. "You only apologize when the person's someone important?" "No, Marks hesitated. "That's not what I meant." Langston stopped at the edge of the street and turned toward the younger agent. His gaze wasn't angry. It was tired, heavy. "Here's the thing, Agent," he said. "You'll make mistakes. We all do. But your mistake today wasn't that you didn't recognize me. Your mistake was being ready to pull a gun on someone who hadn't done a damn thing wrong." Langston held his eyes for a moment, then nodded once and stepped into the black SUV, waiting at the curb. The door closed with a quiet finality. Inside the vehicle, the colonel exhaled slowly and looked out the window. People were still pointing, still filming, still whispering. But none of it mattered. He wasn't there to be recognized. He had come to that bank to transfer a portion of his savings to a community foundation he'd helped create, a fund for veterans struggling with housing, medical bills, and trauma therapy, money he had earned through decades of service, sacrifice, and scars both visible and invisible. But instead of quietly wiring funds to help others, he'd been mistaken for a threat. He'd been saluted after being profiled. He should have been furious, but he wasn't. He was tired. Tired of this dance, of having to prove himself again and again to people who wouldn't see past the surface. Tired of the double-checking, sideways looks. It's the subtle doubt that trailed him like a shadow, no matter how much good he'd done. This wasn't the first time, and something in him said it wouldn't be the last. Meanwhile, inside the bank, the mood had changed completely. The young woman who had spoken up earlier, the first to thank him, sat quietly in a chair by the window, staring at her phone. She'd found a video already uploaded online. The clip was short, barely 2 minutes, but it was already gaining traction. Thousands of likes, thousands of comments. How do you mistake a Medal of Honor recipient for a criminal? This is exactly what black professionals go through. Doesn't matter how decorated you are. The dignity this man showed. I'm speechless. Bank manager should be fired on the spot. Greg felt his stomach twist. He looked over and saw a teenage boy near the corner scrolling through the same clip. The boy looked up, met Greg's eyes, shook his head slowly before turning away. No words, just disappointment. The thing Greg couldn't shake wasn't just the mistake. It was the certainty he'd had. The absolute confidence in his gut feeling. It had felt so right in the moment. But that feeling had nearly led to a national disgrace.
Oh yeah, nice.
It had led to a personal one. And Colonel Langston? He hadn't yelled. He hadn't demanded anything. He had simply been who he was, and let that do the talking. That was the part Greg couldn't stop thinking about. The quiet power, the self-control, the integrity. He didn't call his lawyer. He didn't call the news. He called no one. He just walked out with all the grace that Greg had never deserved from him. Back in the SUV, Langston's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from his daughter. Saw the video. Are you okay? Want me to call someone? He smiled faintly, thumbs tapping a reply. I'm okay. Tell the boys I'll be home for dinner. He stared out the window again as the car moved forward. A group of young boys on bikes passed the vehicle, glancing through the tinted glass. One of them pointed and said something to the others. He couldn't see him clearly, but they had a feeling. Langston didn't wave, but he smiled, because this moment wasn't for him, was for them. For everyone watching, it's for everyone who'd ever been made to feel like they didn't belong somewhere they'd earned the right to be. A bank, a boardroom, a classroom. Sometimes change didn't come with marching bands or speeches. Sometimes it came from a quiet man in a tailored suit walking out of a bank. Having turned an insult into a moment of truth, back inside the building, the bank manager finally gathered enough strength to speak to the staff. He started. I need a moment. He walked to the break room, heart pounding. The silence behind him was louder than applause. That afternoon, Branch issued a statement. Sterile, apologetic. Carefully reviewed by corporate PR, it hit the web by evening, but it didn't help, because the video spoke for itself. And Langston never responded publicly. He didn't need to. He had already said everything that mattered. Next time, treat people like they belong, before you assume they don't. The words outlived the moment. They landed in classrooms, in newsrooms, in barbershops, in dinner table debates. And slowly, quietly, they began to echo in the places that needed them most. Some people clapped, some people scoffed, but no one forgot. Because on that ordinary day, in that ordinary bank, a man who had faced war, seen death, and worn the weight of honor on his chest, showed the world what true power looked like. And that is where the story ends. Not in handcuffs, not in outrage, but in honor, calm, unshakable, unforgettable.